So tonight I watched a film I have been meaning to watch for many, many years, and this is 1980's Times Square, directed by Allan Moyle. I can't remember how I first came across this movie, but I have a distinct memory. I think it was like somehow I came across the trailer on YouTube or something, and 'cause it has Trini Alvarado in it, and she's in Little Women and Frighteners, and um, somehow I went down the rabbit hole of the internet and found this trailer and was like, "What is this movie? Oh God!" However, it's never streaming anywhere, and so you have to like track down a disc. So, um, finally, after many years of living near Videodrome, I finally rented this one. Because of all things, I was returning my discs that I rented last week, and right by the counter, they had the music section. And I just was like looking while I was, whatever, and like the holy grail, it went whoa, and the spine just was like, this is the movie, rent me. And so I grabbed it, and then right next to it's the one I'm going to watch tomorrow, which is What's Love Got to Do with It, because I haven't seen that either. But to the film that I watched, Times Square, this movie is so good. It's one of those like flawed films that and there's a on the disc there's an audio commentary where they kind of talk about how the film could have been what they wanted it to be, but unfortunately, as often is the case, there were too many cooks and things got changed, not necessarily for the better. So I'll get to that. The plot is that Nikki Murata, played by Robin Johnson, is sort of a young street kid, and she gets arrested for smashing the car of club owners. The lights on his car after she plays like really loud rock and roll in his like uh behind his club. And she's just a punk, it's 1980, she's a punk. She gets arrested, she's a youth, so they take her to a mental hospital to check on like, is she okay? She clearly has some anger issues and other things. While there, she meets a slightly younger, very rich young woman played by Trini Alvarado, who's dealing with with depression after her mother has died. She has acted out on this by writing letters to a DJ played by the one, the only Tim Curry, signing her letters Zombie Girl. Eventually, and her father is in charge. He's like the commissioner in charge of basically Disneyfying Times Square and taking it away from how wonderful it is. So, uh, Nikki and Pamela become friends. When Nikki gets released and is supposed to come back and see a social worker, instead she takes Pam with her and they run off. And this is where the movie gets both great and sort of implausible. The two women, they're girls, so she's like 13 and 15. They move into like a abandoned warehouse near the Port Authority and start doing petty theft and washing car windows and all kinds of things in order to survive. Eventually, getting a whole bunch of stuff in their new digs, like way too much stuff for like, are they stealing all this stuff? I'm not really sure. And eventually, the Trini Alvarado character ends up working kind of at a strip club, but she doesn't strip; she just dances. But she's 13, so it's a little like. What is cut from this film and what was in the script and in the original film before it was sort of trimmed and is still sort of there is this it's there as subtext now, but there were scenes that were text that they were a lesbian couple, like lesbian teens, and that's who they are and that's the connection they have. And unfortunately, most of that got chopped. So the film, sort of the emotional heft of the film is not as strong as it could be because they were forced to chop all of that, and that is really unfortunate. The film gets a little implausible as it goes on, and sort of the things that happen to them and the things that they do don't quite make any sense. Like her father eventually finds her, but like she doesn't want to come home, so he doesn't force her, and all kinds of things. And I'm like, where is Child Protective Services? At least for the rich girl, because the Nikki character is just falling through the cracks. And there's moments where you think like they would probably have been, things would have probably happened to two young girls at this age. Um, let's just put it that way. But it's a fantasy. Let's go with that. It's a punk teen fantasy. And it feels cut from the same cloth as some films that were come out later, like Smithereens and even Desperately Seeking Susan. Except those are adults, not teenagers. But these girls like eventually are going to be Susan from Desperately Seeking Susan or Ren from Smithereens. It also feels with its soundtrack a bit like and feel a bit like the two Diane Lane films from this era, Ladies and Gentlemen, The Fabulous Stains, and Streets of Fire. Like all of those films have a very similar undercurrent of anger and isolation and rebellion and teenage girl punk rockness that I really love. Except obviously, that's really Seeking Susan. They're not teenagers, but you get that point. This has an amazing soundtrack featuring. I'm clicking on it. Wow. Okay, hold on. The Ramones, The Cure, XTC, Lou Reed, Gary Newman, Talking Heads. Great sequence with Life During Wartime where the two girls are walking down the street and they're dancing and people are dancing around them, and it's almost like a musical moment except that it feels like a real moment. So good. Joe Jackson, The Pretenders, Patti Smith, and there was one other really great one. What was it? Well, then they also sing a few songs. There's one sequence where Trini Alvarado does sort of a punk rap kind of thing that is so good. Just fantastic. And apparently David Bowie was supposed to do a song for this soundtrack, and that didn't happen. So that's a real bummer. This disc is hard to find. It's way super out of print. It was released 17 years ago, if you can imagine. But there's a Studio Canal version out in Europe, so you can probably track that down if you have a region-free DVD player. Thankfully, I got this from Videodrome, my local video rental store. Just great performances, great chemistry. Tim Curry is fantastic in the handful of scenes that he gets. The stuff with the dad doesn't really work, mostly because that whole plot doesn't make sense to me. And some of the things they added don't quite work either. Like somewhere in here was a truly great film. What we're left with is still a great film, but it's one of those like great films that's great because of what because of the time sort of capsule that it is, and the fact that it really wanted to be a great film and got kind of caught between too many cooks. It was not well received when it came out, but now obviously it has this cult following, and rightfully so, because what is great is so great that it makes you really bummed that it didn't get to be what it could have been. And unfortunately, the director, Allan Moyle, says that like he can't even do a director's cut because most of the scenes and things that he would have put back in, the footage is just gone. Which is like, ugh, anytime you're a director and like production studio makes you chop things from your film, you should just like hide that film somewhere else later. But like you don't know that in 1980, so what are you gonna do? I'd highly recommend trying to find this film, tracking it down, watching it. It is really great. One of the great 80s punk films, one of the great music films, one of the great best friend films / lesbian films, like just one of the great films. And I'm so glad I finally saw it. This is 1980s Times Square, and I just really loved it. And you should try to find it.